Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Metropolis Radio. Today we are looking at the Netflix movie Enola Holmes. Now I know that I titled this video as this movie being a missed opportunity. Now does that mean that this movie is inherently bad? Well, not really. You can still have a decent movie and have it still be considered a missed opportunity in a couple of different factors, whether it's related to character or plot development or other things that this movie is pushing, with regards to agenda. So why is it that I'm stating that this movie is a missed opportunity? Well, I guess you're just going to have to stay tuned to find out. Now, before we get started, if you like the content that I produce, subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the BitChute channel. It's a small click for you, but for a small channel like mine, it helps out a lot. Like, comment, and share the video around only if you want to. Follow me on the blog and all the social medias. Links will be in the description below. So with that out of the way, let's get right into Enola Holmes. Now, as always, I start off by looking at the creative team, and this movie was directed by Harry Bradbeer. Now, this movie marks his feature directorial debut. He has worked as a TV director on shows such as Killing Eve, Fleabag. I think both of those. I know Fleabag is Phoebe Waller-Bridge. I don't remember if she was also behind Killing Eve, but don't quote me on that. Prisoners' Wives, Sugar Rush, etc. A lot of British TV that listeners in the US may have never heard of outside of Killing Eve and Fleabag, only because Fleabag is on Amazon Prime here in the States. And this movie was written by Jack Thorne. Now, the only movie that he's wrote that I've heard of is Wonder with Owen Wilson, and he's currently working as a writer and EP executive producer on the HBO series His Dark Materials. Now, for those that don't know, His Dark Materials is a trilogy of fantasy novels written by Philip Pullman. Now, you may have heard of the first book called The Golden Compass, and it did have a movie adaptation with Daniel Craig and Nicole Kidman back in the early to late 2000s. I want to say, I don't remember. I know it was around that time. Now let's take a minute to talk about the original source material, and no, this character was not created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. This was a series of novels written by Nancy Springer, an American author that's been writing since the 1970s, not the Enola Holmes books. Getting to the books that the movie was based on, the Enola Holmes mysteries had 6 books and were published between 2007 and 2010. And the movie is actually based on the first book titled "The Case of the Missing Mark." I think it's pronounced Marquess, Missing Marquess or Marquess. If I mispronounced that, whoopsie. But I'm not that familiar with British terms, so yeah, fuck it. I'm just gonna roll with it. Now let's move on to our character analysis for the movie, and we're going to start off with the title character. That is Enola Holmes, played by Millie Bobby Brown. Most of you probably know her from Stranger Things, and funny enough, I have never seen 1 second of Stranger Things. I know, it's like sacrilege in 2020. Oh my god, how have you not seen Stranger Things? Well, now you finally found someone who's never seen a single second of Stranger Things. And personally, I like her performance as Enola Holmes. And there's nothing to compare it to since this is a recently created character. And like I said, and not by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. The only big criticism that I have of her character is all the fourth wall breaks that she does. Now, this technique, it works really well in a comedy. But if she is to be the next Sherlock Holmes in a sense, then I need to feel like she is the next Sherlock Holmes. I just personally can't stand all of the nudging to the audience if it isn't done for comedic purposes. If you get a lot of taps on the shoulder and it goes, ha ha ha, did you get that? Ha ha ha. Once or twice is fine. They did that in the opening for the introduction where it's like, let me catch you up on some things and, the entire backstory. That shit was fine. You need to set up the backstory. But after that, shit can all of those fourth wall breaks. They're not necessary. And yeah, this is a quote-unquote Sherlock Holmes movie here. We're not watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller. Anyway, before I tangent off on Ferris Bueller, next we have Henry Cavill as Sherlock Holmes. Now, I do like how Sherlock is very laissez-faire in this movie, given that the movie doesn't really center around him, but that of his younger sister. And personally, I would like to see more movies with Henry Cavill's Sherlock Holmes after we get the long-anticipated Sherlock Holmes 3 with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law. Because, let's be honest here, Robert Downey Jr., I think he's getting up in his 50s. He's probably already there, probably at least in his early 50s. So chances are very high, well, not chances are very high. The word, what am I trying to look for here? In terms of action movies, when you hit 50, you're a very old man in terms of that. Whereas, you have Henry Cavill, who's only in his mid-30s, so he's still got a good 10, 15 years to go versus someone like Robert Downey Jr., how long is he going to be able to keep going? Yeah, Tom Cruise is a fucking maniac in the Mission Impossible movies, but again, Tom Cruise is the exception here and not really the rule. Next, we have Sam Claflin as Mycroft Holmes, and I have a very big problem with Mycroft in this movie. He is simply here to push the ideology that is prevalent throughout it, and that ideology being like the early days of women's suffrage. He's the only one in the movie to do that one thing. He's only in this movie to do that one thing alone. We see it from him wanting to put Enola in the boarding school for girls, to reassuring that, you are my ward! Now, I couldn't say this on the all-new Mega Podtastic podcast at the time when I put this on the damage report, because I felt that this was a spoiler. And if we're honestly looking at Mycroft with this, Mycroft is not Mycroft. For those that don't know, Mycroft Holmes, the brother of Sherlock Holmes, his intelligence is actually superior to Sherlock's, but the only reason he's not working as a detective is because he's a lazy-ass motherfucker who doesn't like to do any work. So, pretty much, that's why Sherlock gets all the credit while, Mycroft does all the bitch work for the British government because he can't be bothered to, get out into the field. Well, not in this movie. He has a hell of a lot more energy tracking down Enola all up and down the streets of London than he ever did in any of the books. And then we have Helena Bonham Carter as Eudoria Holmes. It took me a second to pronounce that. That is the mother of Enola, the mother of Enola, Sherlock, and Mycroft. Now, she disappears in the beginning of the movie, and it turns out she was a part of the women's suffrage movement. Surprise, surprise there. But she was a part of the extremist side of it. She was part of a group that wanted to bomb buildings to send their message, and word of advice, that's not really a way to win anybody onto your side, because you're going to get a shit ton of people killed, and they're not going to care what you're pushing. All they're going to care about is, oh my God, my husband, my brother, my whoever, died in this bombing, blah, 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 blah. Then next up, we have Louis Partridge as Tewkesbury, and now he is the Marquess that Enola meets on the train, helps out, and then later saves from the person who was trying to murder him, and we'll dive more into that in a few minutes. And finally, we have Burn Gorman as Linthorne. He's the private investigator tracking down Tewkesbury throughout the movie and constantly pestering Enola along the way. Now, I only bring him up because it's Burn Gorman, and personally, I remember him from Torchwood. I don't remember the name of the character he played, though. I know he was in the first 2 seasons of it, the best seasons of Torchwood, before it got sold to Starz and went off the fucking deep end. In season 2, he died, got brought back to life, and then killed off again by a nuclear bomb. Now, you're going to have to watch Torchwood in order to see how that happens if you're curious, because if I were to get into it here, we would be here for possibly another 20 minutes, because it would basically be a season 2 review of the Torchwood series. Now let's move on to the narrative analysis portion of this. And like I said, the movie is based off the first book in the series, that Enola Holmes Mysteries, The Case of the Missing Marquess. So how the movie starts is Enola's mom goes missing, so Sherlock and Mycroft return home to investigate. During this time, Enola becomes Mycroft's ward, and he wants to send her to a boarding school to become a lady, and yes, those did exist back in the late 19th, early 20th century England, back when society was a lot different. Enola escapes to London to go and basically find her mother herself, and during this, she just happens to stumble across Tewkesbury, the missing Marquess. Now she finds out that someone is hunting him down too, and they work together to reach London, but once they both get there, they go their separate ways, no fuss, no muss, done. Now during the case of finding her mother, Enola stumbles upon the extremist women's suffrage plot to blow up certain buildings to get their message heard. Again, Not the best idea to get your message across, but that's neither here nor there. But she keeps getting chased down by Linthorne because Linthorne keeps thinking that Tewksbury is with her. And Linthorne is hired to basically return Tewksbury to his family so they can basically kill him. So she basically deems that it's within her best interest to find the missing Marquess, and that happened to be Tewksbury, as I said. And the case of Tewksbury is basically someone in his family is trying to kill him, and Enola needs to find out who it is before he's killed. At one point, she's captured by Mycroft and sent to the boarding school, while Tewksbury escapes because if he's caught, he'll die. If she's caught, she'll just be forced to live a life that she doesn't want. Okay, fine. Tewksbury breaks her out of the boarding school, and they find out who's trying to kill him. It's his grandmother because he would gain a seat in Parliament or something. It was one of those two. I don't know how British politics work, nor do I care to know how they work. I'm over here in the States, and I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to move on. His grandmother didn't want him voting in favor of the women's suffrage movement at the time. Surprise, surprise there. The vote goes through anyway, so there's no real reason for Enola to find her mother after this, and her mother just randomly shows up at the end, probably just for the closure of the storyline that's earlier in the movie, of basically, now that Tewksbury has voted for that bill to pass, there's no real reason for the extremist women's suffrage movement to exist. And Sherlock tries to get her to meet him somewhere, but she wisens up to the tactic and chooses not to show, and basically stays in London, quote-unquote, undercover. Now let's take a quick look at how this movie was received. And keep in mind, this movie is on a streaming service, Netflix. Therefore, there is no box office gross or reported budget. And on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has a tomato meter score of 91%. Surprise, surprise there. Based on 179 critic reviews, with the critics' consensus being, quote, Enola Holmes brings a breath of fresh air to Baker Street and leaves plenty of room for Millie Bobby Brown to put her effervescent stamp on a franchise in waiting, end quote. Yeah, try saying that 5 times fast. And this movie has an audience score of 71%. Sorry, not 715. Whoops. 71% based on 2,970 audience reviews. And this movie has a Metacritic score of 68 based on 30 critic reviews and a user score of 5.5 out of 10 based on 306 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 6.6 out of 10 based on 96,524 reviews. Now, in its debut weekend, this was the second most watched thing on Netflix behind the streaming series Ratched that's set prior to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In October of 2020, Netflix reported that this movie was on track to be viewed by 76 million households over its first 4 weeks of release. In November 2020, Variety reported that the movie was the 13th most watched straight-to-streaming title of 2020 up to that date. Now that may change by the time that this video comes out. Now I just want to end this off and basically state that I don't think that this movie was terrible. You can tell that this movie was meant to get a theatrical release, but COVID basically ended those plans. Warner Brothers sold the distribution rights to this movie back in April, and Netflix picked it up and released it in the end of September 2020. Now, the reason that I claim that this movie is a missed opportunity is because the filmmakers pushed the agenda over everything else. There is a decent movie underneath all of that with the case of the missing Marquess, but this is a case where the agenda gets in the way of an otherwise decent movie. When I was on the Megapodtastic podcast, I put this movie under their damage report section, and I didn't elaborate at the time because I felt that my criticisms really went into spoiler territory, and the movie was only released 2 weeks prior to the recording of that podcast episode. And personally, I'm not against politics in movies. Sherlock Holmes 2009 and Sherlock Holmes Game of Shadows did that. Sherlock 09 was about a black magic occultist that wanted to take over England by wiping out Parliament, and Sherlock Holmes A Game of Shadows, the sequel to it, was about Moriarty wanting to start World War I by killing off a Frenchman and blaming it on the Germans, and then killing off the German in Switzerland at the peace conference and blaming it on the French to start industrial warfare. And I said this in my Mad Max Fury Road retrospective, that if you placate to the identity politics of the time, then all you have done is destined your movie to not work outside of the context of whatever the identity politics were of 2019, 2020. So how's this movie going to hold up in like 2026? Because identity politics, and I said this in the Mad Max Fury Road retrospective, identity politics shift like that all the time. It's like dealing with corporate politics. You never want to get into that game. So I'm going to truly end it off, and I'm going to ponder this question. Am I against a sequel to this movie? I'm actually not against that idea, but they need to move away from the identity politics aspect of it. The filmmakers have done it once, and in this arena, you can't get away with pulling the same hat trick twice. Eventually, people will catch on to what it is you're about, and they're just going to start dropping off like flies, and all of a sudden, all of this potential that you had to make this great series, out of Enola Holmes is now dead because you couldn't resist the urge to push your politics over pushing, a good story with decent characters. No. The agenda has to come first. Don't ever push agenda before good story and decently written characters. And that's all I've got for you guys this week. So I will see you guys next time.